welcome to the Cardboard Herald podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am Eric, joined as always by my lovely, irreverent co-host, Jack. How are you doing today, Jack?
Feeling awfully irreverent, you know, how I do, as I'm known for.
The normal, the thing that you're known for frequently. Irreverent.
Yeah, very blue, very irreverent. You know, everyone's like, man, he cuts, but he cuts deep. Is that what I'm known for?
Exactly.
I'm irreverent.
Yeah, exactly.
No reverence over here.
The reverence. Well, welcome in. How are you doing this week, Jack? You doing good, all things considered?
Yeah.
I don't know overall, what the things to consider are. I don't really know why I live with that sentence.
Oh man. Okay. Well, we're just going to go over NPR all things considered review cast. I guess that could be one thing to consider. No, I'm doing good. Things are pretty great on the channel right now. I was happy to get out a quick review of Park 2nd Edition, which went up on the channel, and it was kind of a special project because 5 years ago, just a little over 5 years ago, which I couldn't believe how long ago that was, I recorded a review for the original parks out at the Mendenhall Glacier area here in Juneau. And so I went and kind of did a sequel to that, which was a time for some reflection, which made sense because it's a second edition of this game. And more than anything, it was a cause to go back and listen to or watch an old review. And man, anytime when I think I'm having some audio issues on a video where I'm the audio isn't that good. Holy crap, what I thought was okay 5 years ago was apparently... I should have no worries about anything I'm posting at this point. When people talk about potato quality for visuals, it is potato quality audio. But other than that, things are going good. How are you doing, Eric?
I'm doing well. I'm getting ready to go on a trip. I'm heading down to... Puerto Rico for a friend's wedding. I call her my first wife because I married her in a middle school play. And she's my sister's best friend still, and so we're gonna go down to celebrate with her. So I'm very happy to get out of the very rainy DC weather right now. I went on a run earlier, and it was supposed to be 10 miles, and we got an utter downpour starting at around mile 3. So I ran 6 miles because it took me 3 more miles just to get back home.
Yeah, well, I gotta imagine with the beard that you're rocking, that kind of downpour is going to be quite the accumulation. You know, you end up weighing an extra 10 pounds just by absorption under your chin.
It's actually good resistance training.
Yeah. Terrible on the neck, though.
Terrible on the neck. Terrible. But
you've been playing any board games lately? I guess we should talk about those on a board game podcast.
People don't tune in to hear us talk about board games. They want to know about the training I do when I run in my beard weight.
Hey, we could turn this into a kettlebell podcast if we wanted to go over my routine right now. That is a whole world in and of itself. And I'm this dorky, soft, touchy-feely type of guy. The world of kettlebells does not typically cater to the soft, touchy-feely audience. Just let's leave it at that.
Well, I have been playing some games. So I've been playing more of Witchcraft. I'm working my way through. There's a campaign in Witchcraft. It's not anything too crazy so far. It doesn't change the gameplay experience that much. But it's interesting, and it definitely gives the game quite a bit of legs for it being a solo-only game, which I've been enjoying a lot. And then I also got a play of Spots in Push Your Luck Dalmatian game.
I like that. I like Dalmatians. As any child who has grown up watching extensive amounts of 101 Dalmatians, I like it.
You mean both movies?
Oh, yes.
Extensive
All
amounts.
well,
Both.
I mean extensive amounts of repeat. Did you not like have a VHS that was
We
just worn
did.
out by
We
playing that over and over again?
not 101 Dalmatians. Lion King was our big jam. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a lot of Lion King. We straddled different Disney generations. I typically think of like my generation ending right around maybe Pocahontas or even Tarzan is maybe the eclipse of our era of Disney. But like Lion King was like third or fourth grade. That was perfect for me. Everyone cared about it. But then we had the older ones that were 101 Dalmatians, Beauty and the Beast. I remember Aladdin coming out. It was a big deal. Return
Yeah.
of Jafar came out. I remember talking even as like second graders being like, well, it's not as good because Robin Williams isn't cast in the role, and that's why they didn't put it in the movie theater, obviously.
I mean, that's probably not wrong.
Yeah.
So
Tell me
definitely
about
not incorrect.
Spots.
So it is a game where you get dealt cards that have dogs on them that you have to roll dice and fill in the spots that you have on your dog. So like all the dogs have like 2 to 4 different places to place die, and the die have to be an exact number. You roll the die. There are like 6 different actions you take. And if you ever have more than at this point I forget because I played it earlier this week, but it's either 7 or 5 die, and you're like, you can't place this dice somewhere section. You bust, and you have to get rid of all the dogs that you have not completed. And it's really tight because you have to. The actions make it really precarious where you can't just do like it's hard to play it safe. You kind of have to take risks, and it's choosing how much of a risk you can take.
I
But then
really
it's
love
also
the
like,
aesthetic of this. I just brought it up. The
yeah,
illustrations are awesome, and the cards themselves are really cool. Initially, when I looked at the cover art, I guess for the original edition, I'm seeing that there's a newer edition. But the original edition makes it look very Dominoes-esque. Whereas the current art that just has the dog in the middle and a couple dice placement on top of it, that's pretty interesting too. I
yeah,
like it.
yeah, it's cool. It's fun little. It's small. It's really easy to teach. Like I can see this being a game that I could play with my parents. Really just about anybody. Yeah, I liked it. I would recommend checking it out. It's on Board Game Arena. That's how I played it. I feel like this would be a game that playing in person might even be more fun just because it's everybody loves rolling dice. Rolling dice is like a universally positive human experience.
Now, I know you're a big Drawpolter fan.
Oh yeah.
Have you played the Oink game Rafter 5?
No. I haven't even
Okay,
I don't think
well,
I've heard of it.
you should look it up. I just played that recently at the local game night here, and you mentioning Spots made me think of like smaller games that I really enjoy. It's a very cool stacking dexterity game. The easiest analog is Rhino Hero Super Battle, but in an Oink-sized box, so it's even more precarious. It is silly and goofy and weird and very Japanese, as with many Oinka games, but it was absolutely a hit and something that was one of those like visceral, as soon as you see it, you know you want to play it types of experiences. Often referred to as like kind of a beer and pretzels type of game. We had experienced gamers, we had newer gamers. We had a 12-year-old, and we had someone who was a grandma there, and we all had a great time at this public gaming event, and it was just a blast.
Right?
Rafter 5, if you like dexterity games, or you have a tolerance for them if they're like of the stacking variety, then this is an easy one to have on hand and worth checking out. You don't really need to think too much about strategy or anything, and that's not really kind of the point of these types of games. The only other thing that I wanted to mention gaming wise, maybe you'll have some recommendations for me or some listeners might, is I've been thinking hard about what it is I like so much about Spirit Island and what I want out of that experience and what I want to maybe not replace that experience, but to replicate that in different ways. It's not just that it's a cooperative game. That's part of it. It's not just that it's a game that's big and meaty with lots of pieces, though that's part of it. Core to the experience to me in Spirit Island that I don't think many other board games do in quite the same way is the kind of cultivation aspect. You feel like you're on the back foot as the invaders are coming in. You have a really distinct character, but then you're making really interesting choices about how you're going to flesh out that character through the growth, through whether you get minor or major powers, how you cultivate the island and the choices that you make about where you position yourself. There's a lot of preparation that one thing leads to another, which leads to another. And it's not really a engine builder, but there is this sort of curve to it, an arc of empowerment that is so tasty in that game, that I'm hoping to find some other experience, particularly in a multiplayer cooperative game. You might already be like, oh my god, Jack, have you played this game Imperium? But the my instincts right now initially led me to Aeon's End, which is a game that people like, but I really haven't touched it all, though I did interview the designer at one point. Then I got turned on to Voidfall, which I thought was a competitive game, which it is, but it also has a cooperative mode, and normally that's like a big red flag for me when a game is both cooperative and competitive, and it can be a little bit of everything. It feels like it's not particularly good at anything, but it seems like, from doing a little research, people really like the cooperative mode, and some people consider that their favorite mode of playing, and there's a lot of comparisons to, like, this is a Space 4X Spirit Island, so I might try and check that out. But I don't know. Based off of my love for Spirit Island, what's in your mind? What do you think you'd recommend to me?
Aeon's End is really solid. I think that is a game. I've played it through Steam, because there was like a Humble Bundle sale at one point or another that I got that as part of it. I think that's really rad. Have you played Mage Knight?
I have, and I got rid of Mage Knight, and then I got
Fair
Mage
enough.
Knight again, and then
well.
I got rid of Mage Knight,
Oh, okay.
and then I got Mage Knight again,
Oh, okay.
and then decided third time it's still not for me, and I got rid of Mage Knight again. Yeah, yeah.
That was the other one I was thinking of, because it's a pretty heavy cooperative game, and you do definitely like build in power, but it's a little obtuse in some ways. So I think that's fair. It's not quite the same as Spirit Island. Voidfall sounds interesting. I remember seeing this. I had no clue there was a. I really should have looked at who designed it. Nigel Buckle and David Turksey, the designers of Imperium.
Yeah.
I should have known there would be Imperium doesn't have cooperative, but to my knowledge, unless
Yes.
there's a community. But
Certainly there are plenty of people who have answered the question, like on BGG, people have asked, if I only intend on ever playing this solo, is it worth getting? And people are like, yes, absolutely. I've only ever played this solo, and I
yeah,
don't regret my purchase. And then there are people asking the same question about cooperative, and there are people being like, I only ever play a cooperative, and I've played it once competitive and instantly recognized that for me, cooperative is the only way that I want to play this game. I would have to see for myself, right? Because
yeah,
hype is real. People who have invested money in something tend to be more favorable towards it because they are either consciously or subconsciously trying to justify their purchase. And especially if you feel like you were part of the campaign to make something come out, which I believe Voidfall was crowdfunded. So I don't know. There's a degree of skepticism, but also optimism involved. So I want to check it out.
yeah, totally. I mean, I think based on what I'm seeing, for one thing, I love Imperium, despite all of
Yep.
its flaws. So I think these same designers, I'm down to go in on anything they have going on. I think I haven't gotten Voidfall yet because of the expense. And also like
It's a chonko.
it's a chonko, and at the same time, like I'm down to play Space 4X games. I don't usually love them. Like I like sci-fi, so I want to like Space 4X games, but they usually don't land for me quite as well. So I think that was like another reason where there were some things that kept me from trying it out. But I mean, it does look great. If there's a cooperative mode, I can see this being a hit. I would love to hear your thoughts after you are able to check it out at some point or another. If you're able to check it out.
I'm a huge Eclipse fan, and this kind of feels like it's in that vein of being like a very Euro-y action 4X game. And Mind Clash has done some really awesome stuff. So, I don't know. I'll check it out. But it's interesting that you bring up Imperium and Mage Knight, and we mentioned Spirit Island, and also we're talking about Voidfall, where some people are like, I only ever play it solo. These are games that are iconically, or purportedly iconically in Voidfall's case, beloved by solo playing audiences. So what does that mean for us?
I mean, I think we are currently at a time where solo board gaming is the best it's ever been. And in 2025, solo board gaming is a super viable path for someone to get into the hobby, I think. We're talking about that this week, which is just solo board gaming in the year 2025. I think that, yeah, there are so many amazing games that came from pandemic era that are just now getting to being published. There are a lot of games that have been published recently that are not solo only games, but have solo modes. I pulled up Board Game Geek just to see what their top sellers are. And aside from Azul Duel, all of these either have a solo mode that's just implemented in the game, or a solo mode implemented by the community in a way that is satisfying. And I think that is kind of the great thing about where we are right now in solo games, is that pretty much any board game coming out right now, this is not true across the board, but for the most part, any board game coming out right now either has a solo mode, a dedicated solo mode, within the rulebook, or there's a community solo mode that has been tested and played and confirmed to be like a good functioning solo mode. And I play a lot of games solo. I mean, I think that that's my primary way of playing games just because of how my work schedule is set up, and also just I like that's how I spend my free time is like I got nothing else going on. I'll either set up something really quick, I'll set up something really big, I will play it by myself. I will have a lovely time doing so. Um, and I think another thing to just consider with it is it's slowly becoming more accepted that this is a thing that you can do.
Right. And we talked about that on prior podcasts where, you know, like solo gaming is something that has had a stigma. Board gaming in general, as adults, has a public stigma, though I think that's largely gone away. Um, but there was a time when if you were like at the water cooler at work and people are like, what do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm really into, I'm on my adult soccer league. Okay, well, what do you do? Oh, I'm really into baking. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I play board games. And people would be like Monopoly? And I don't think that's as persistent of a thing anymore because board games have come to the forefront. That is going to happen to a degree, but it is nowhere near what it was, say, 15 years ago. However, there is a similar stigma that people have towards solo gaming, even among other gamers. Like, you know, like you'll hear people say, like, oh, the reason why I play board games is because it's something for me to do with my friends. It's a social thing. I have no interest in ever playing solo board games. And it's like, well, if you just wanted to hang out with friends, it could be anything. Clearly, there is something that you're invested in with board games. And I think people associate playing board games by yourself as like somehow a lacking endeavor. And it could be that you do want an opponent to challenge you, but if your investment is with the game itself, even partially, then having a solo opponent can be a really interesting way to play a game, and in some ways can be the best way to play a game, especially if you're considering like strategic implications of moves and you don't necessarily have access to players that want to meet you at that same level. Then an automa is, if well designed, can be a fantastic way of testing your strategic muscle, improving your skill at the game, and really exploring systems in a way that opponent who either doesn't want to commit to that level or just doesn't click with the game in the same type of way might not. So that's a cool thing about solo gaming. But one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about when I was throwing around this this topic idea with Eric was that we're at a different era. The first time that I recall hearing largely about solo gaming it was probably early 2010s, probably around the arrival of Mage Knight, and hearing about people talking about playing a cooperative game by themselves. You're playing Pandemic, which wasn't on the box as a 1 to 4 player game. It was a 2 to 4 player game, but playing it by yourself. Lord of the Rings, the Reiner Knizia game, playing that by yourself where you're using multi hands. And then also playing even competitive games, multiple hands, but playing one against another in order to get a game played that wouldn't otherwise be something that you'd get to the table. And then I think it was, I mean, certainly there were other game companies that were developing solo modes at this point. But when I first took notice that it was really becoming an official thing was when Viticulture came out, and Morten Monrad Peterson, who is now the head of the Automa factory that almost exclusively, I think, works with Stonemaier Games, or rather, Stonemaier Games exclusively works with them for Automa, and they've branched out to other things. I think Morton contacted Stonemaier and was like, "Hey, you're coming out with this cool game. Do you mind if I get some of the documents, because I'd love to like actually create a solo mode for this?" I think it was just a fan endeavor at first. I'd have to go back. I have a couple interviews with Morton that I could have researched for this, and Jamie Stegmaier talking about this event as well. But that's when it felt like it was becoming an official thing, and especially with the arrival, to me, of Terraforming Mars and Scythe right at the same time. That's like 2016. That's when like these big games were like, hey, we have components and dedicated modes, large sections of our rule books that are about solo gaming, and we are adopting this as a completely justifiable reason why you might purchase this game. And that felt like a big shift. And then COVID happened, and that's when I think it shifted from being something where it was a nice accommodation that would occasionally happen to board game publishers were seeing that unless we have the absolute love of our audience, we have to have a single player and 2-player version of our game to have any real viability. Coming out with something that was 3 and up was an absolute rarity, because you had no idea if people were going to be able to find the audience for that. And now we're in this post-COVID world. There are still some big name games that are coming out that don't have it. You know, you mentioned Azul Duel. Obviously, Arcs isn't a solo mode game out of the box, but Leader Games did just hire someone to be a dedicated solo designer there. I don't know. Like, we're in a different world, and I've been talking for a while. What are your thoughts about like where we are as a solo gameplay community now, contrasted to, you know, say like when you first started doing, you know, your tiptoes into board gaming?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, and I'll say me getting into board games was around 2016. Like, that is, I mean, maybe 2015 was when I was dipping my toes in with Catan and Pandemic. So for me, solo gaming has, for the most part, been at least a facet of the community. It was definitely not like the primary way I played games back then. Like, I was only playing games in social settings. But I think it was the work schedule I had right out of college was a lot of days working and then a lot of days not working, and I just started being like, oh, I love playing board games. I have these games that have solo modes like Pandemic, and then that got me into getting Gloomhaven, and then just playing through Gloomhaven solo, and like having all of these experiences where I was just like, to me, this is just a thing that happens. But it's become more and more accessible. Like, I, at this point, am more surprised if a game doesn't have a solo mode. Like, from when I first entered the hobby, super reasonable for a game to just not have any solo mode at all. And now it's definitely to the point where I expect a game to have a solo mode, and if it doesn't, I expect the community to have made one for it. For example, Arcs. Arcs doesn't have a solo mode out of the box, but there are like 5 or 10 solo modes on Board Game Geek. And at this point, any game that I purchase, unless it is a dedicated 2-player game, that's the only time where I think that solo modes can work, but not always in dedicated two-player games. But that's like the time where I'm like, okay, this game might or it might not. I'd have to look into it before I get the game. But yeah, at this point, pretty much any board game I own, I expect to have a solo mode, either through the box or through the community. And it's become just such a through line for a lot of games and how I experience them at least.
Do you think that there is a consideration for like solo dedicated components that I mean, obviously, you and I have both played solo games. Almost every game that has a solo mode, I at least try the solo mode. I do more multiplayer gaming, contrasted to your more frequently playing games solo. But we both consume the material.
Yeah.
What about, like, I don't know. Like, I kind of hate when there are variants to a game and there are elements that are dedicated to that variant and I just never touch it. And they just kind of sit in the box and I go like, man, I wish they hadn't spent production money on this whole thing that I never touch. Do you think that people who never want to play a solo game, that they look at the solo materials in the same way? Like, man, this game could have been $5 cheaper if they didn't have the development time and the production costs on the solo cards and tokens and all the other crap that's in this box.
I mean, probably, but that's kind of their problem to deal with. Like,
Well, I mean,
yeah, in my
it
mind,
is their problem to deal with, but
Yeah.
it is interesting that there is a expectation now that you're going to have a solo mode, right? And so now, in a time where margins are really small, people are talking about the tariffs that just got announced.
Yeah.
I sent you and the Cardboard
Yeah.
Underground, which is our group for PAX dwellers, an article from a company, a one-man company that is like, hey, Reddit audience, tell me how you feel about, like, if I were to say I need some extra help to actually deliver a game and I'm going to break down all my numbers here. And I thought it was like a really transparent and earnest, like, here's what I'm facing and here's what I did with my last game. And if I had this again, it would be like financial collapse for the company. So how do you think you would want to be communicated with if you backed my game? And I found it more interesting from the kind of like numbers perspective. And now is like, well, I gotta have the production costs because I gotta have the solo thing. But I guess I don't know. It's capitalism, right?
Yeah, my 2 cents on that are: one, it helps sell games. Like, if I know a game has a in the box solo mode, that tells me, one, that they've play tested it enough that they are willing to include it in the box. Two, if there are extra components, they have made the decision that those components are necessary enough to include in the solo mode to make them and figure out a spot for them in the box. So for me, as a person who mainly plays games solo, that helps sell games to me. Like,
Right.
if I know that I'm getting a solo mode from the publisher, I will take that over a Board Game Geek solo mode any day of the week. So it's helping them sell games. And on top of that, I think about it also a bit in reverse, which is there are parts of the game that I don't touch if I'm only ever playing a game solo. And at the same time that I wouldn't want to take away my solo experience from a game because I didn't want it to fit in the box, or I was worried that things would not fit into the box. I don't want to take away the multiplayer experience for the people who that is the primary way they play. So
Yeah.
in my mind, I understand that it is getting more expensive to make games, due to rising production costs and the tariff scare that we're still seeing how it's going to work out for people importing games into the United States. Um, so it is a consideration that it's maybe a bit unfortunate that their components are being made that are going to make
Yeah.
games more expensive for people who won't engage with them. At the same
Yeah.
time, it's a little, the publishers are just going to have to make some decisions on whether or not they would like to sell the games to an audience of solo board gamers, or if they want to outsource that development time and component cost to the people on Board Game Geek, where they're just going to say, hey, we're not going to include a solo mode because clearly the community is doing it for themselves. And they're just going to have to weigh that with, will that make up the cost of the game?
Yeah. I guess it all comes down to, is it going to attract more people if you have solo on the box? And
Yeah.
publishers are doing it because it does. And I honestly think that most solo modes are savvy enough that they don't require that much additional overhead and components.
Hopefully.
But this was a discussion on Reddit not too long ago where someone was like, ugh, I hate, all these dedicated solo modes in the game. They're making my games more expensive. And I was like, I never really thought about it that way because, like I do think of game bloat was stuff that I never want to engage with. And modularity is often a big problem with that. But, I never really thought of solo modes as being part of that. But let's talk about like now here in 2025. We have so many types of games that have had interesting solo adaptations that I back in 2015, 2016, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that there would be meaningful and cool ways to play these games. A good example of this is the Fellowship of the Ring trick-taking game.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, the trick-taking game. God, that's a terrible name. But point being is there is a trick-taking game with a solo mode, and it works pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people on Reddit and BGG and other areas who are playing it specifically as a solo game who are having a really good time with it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are the things that you're either most delighted in? What makes a good solo game to you? And what are some examples of like games that kind of continue to impress you in their solo adaptations?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the thing that I most want out of a solo game or a solo mode is just being mentally engaged while I'm playing. Like, for the most part, I think there are some times where I just want to have a game on the table and I clock out mentally. Like, this is just a stress relief thing. Cascadia is definitely there for me. Where it's
Yeah, I mentally clock out when I play a Cascadia as well.
I know you do. But I think I want games that either give me some sort of asymmetry to deal with, which is why Spirit Island is a rad solo game. Imperium works really well. Imperium is, in my opinion, for one thing, it's my most played solo game. Where that is just there's so much asymmetry to take care of, or take a handle of every time you play, where you have to learn your faction, you have to learn the faction you're playing against, and you can play against the same faction, playing the same faction, and it's going to be a really different experience each time just based on what cards come out. So for me, I think having something new every time I play, or new choices, are really, that's the thing that's going to make me play a game solo over and over. I also don't necessarily love a game that just has AI, not AI. AI is not quite the right term for it, but just an opponent that is supposed to mimic a human player. Like I think
Right.
there are some games that have that where it just doesn't land, and
Yeah.
it doesn't give you the depth of playing against another player, and it doesn't give you the depth to make interesting choices because you're gonna win the game anyways.
Yeah. Very true. I tend to think of this as like I think when I first played Wingspan solo is when I really codified this feeling, which I really like the Automa and Wingspan. And in that, it really simulates the experience of playing against a real opponent in that you're effectively doing the same thing that you would do otherwise. And the opponent is having the same interactions with the game that you would experience from an actual person. They're going to take up some of the eggs, they're going to activate some powers, they're going to compete with you on the end game scoring things, but it doesn't have the overhead of actually having to perform all those actions. It has very rudimentary steps that are involved that still provide you the experience of playing the game, and a challenge that isn't, I guess, just predictable. Like it has a degree of randomness that, it has the unpredictability of a human that you're playing against, with a degree of accountability that it will make choices that are meaningful for it, or generally meaningful for it.
Yeah.
If it's too rudimentary, then it just kind of feels solitary instead of
Yeah.
solo, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's too laborious, and I think to contrast a Stonemaier versus Stonemaier game, a lot of people really like Scythe, and Scythe was one of the first games that I played solo, but I don't actually like the game solo at this point. I mean, it's fine, and I'm glad that it's there, but I think it has too much overhead involved in the performance of the solo in that game, and that may be partly at fault with one of the most difficult types of games to adapt well, is like a dudes on a map combat heavy
Yeah.
game. I think Mind Clash, we were talking about Mind Clash earlier, did a pretty valiant attempt with Ironwood, which is a dedicated two-player game, but has some solo progression for each faction that you can play as. That has a good amount of overhead, but it is good.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but good. And then hidden movement and games with deception as an element, social deduction, are the other types of games that tend to be the hardest to come up with an
Yeah.
interesting adaptation.
I think that just goes with the joy of those games comes from trying to
Yeah,
decipher your opponent, which if it's a deck of cards, it's either so random that you can't engage in that part of the game, or it's so not randomized that it is trivial to interact with that part of the game of trying to like figure out what your opponent is doing. And that just is kind of what it is. And I
yeah,
think that those games, if anybody has ever made a good solo mode of a pre-existing like hidden movement or social deduction game, I will be very interested to try it out. Does Codenames? Hold on, I'm gonna check right now on Board Game Geeks. Does Codenames have a solo mode?
I'm actually looking up right now. Beast, does Beast have a solo mode? And sure enough, play as Beast against Hunter bots.
That makes sense.
Yep.
Hold on, let me search.
And replies, are very positive about this solo mode and some of the feedback, which I also love how much of the community engagement is here. Not only the person coming up with the solo mode, but the feedback that the players, who are essentially playtesters, are giving, and the amount of iteration that has clearly gone into this based off of the feedback. So once again, solo community just really, really crushing it here. But yeah, like, you put a game out there, and solo gamers are going to find a way to make a solo mode, whether you wanted one or not. Not to say that that should be exploited. And if you're a publisher, then I think if you haven't already come up with a solo mode, and you're on the verge of publishing a game, then consider bringing in a secondary designer for the dedicated solo mode. There are plenty that have done that. A great example is Ricky Royal did the solo mode for PAX Premier, which I still think is the best solo mode for any of Cole Worley's games to date. And it maybe is my favorite way to play PAX Premier. But like, Cole was like, I don't really have the experience in playing solo games. That's not really my jam. However, I see the value in it, and I want to bring in someone who really understands these types of games and can, like, bring a panache to this that I think rises to what the design deserves. And that was extremely successful. Or now I'm just, I guess, Cole Whirling. I'm spiraling out and keep going here. On Root, there was an initial real bad Mechanical Marquise solo mode that was, it was bad. Part of that early wave of, like, well, we should accommodate everyone. Let's put a solo mode in here, and it was bad. And it wasn't until the community came up with the Mechanical Marquise 2.0 and all of the robotic factions, which then Leader Games approached the designer of those to make those official expansions in the official solo mode, and continued to produce that in conjunction with that designer, which is, like a great way to go about it. That if you don't have a solo mode, but you think that you could sell an expansion as a solo dedicated expansion, then look to the community and see if someone has done it, and see if you can work out an agreement to use that as the design. You don't have to put everything on your back, especially if you don't have the experience in designing solo games.
Yeah, and the thing that I was going to say, I was thinking about it earlier and just wasn't quite sure at what point to bring it up, but games that have been out for a bit can also get a solo mode added in, either later on via expansion or through apps. Like, I've played Clank solo. Clank does not have a solo mode in the box, but Renegade Games, I think that's the publisher, Direwolf Digital is the one who implemented it, so I'll say them, made a solo mode of Clank. Like that, you can do that. You can do expansions that introduce it. Furnace has solo modes available on Board Game Geek, but then they also have the expansion, which has a solo mode that they introduce after the release of the original game. So solo modes are just way more easy to... they're far easier to implement, I feel like, nowadays. With, you can have computers do the solo mode version of it, so the computers are doing all the heavy lifting of it through apps. When I looked up Codenames solo, one thing I found was an April Fool's Day post by the publisher saying that Codenames solo existed, and then the other one was, there's apparently, through the Codenames app, they do like daily puzzles of Codenames that they'll like give you a clue, and you have to figure out what the things are in it. That's technically a solo mode. I haven't played that one, so I'm not going to comment too much. I just found it. But like you can make more expectations that your players will have a phone that can operate the solo mode work that needs to be done, because I agree that especially early on there were a lot of solo modes that required the player to do all of the work to
Hmm.
do the small part of the fun part of the game. Like with Scythe Solo, I haven't played, but based on your description, I've played games very similar where most of the solo mode is busy work to reset so that you can play solo again. So I think we're also at a point where phones and apps can be used to augment a game that doesn't have a solo mode so that it can have a solo mode.
Right. Yeah, apps are. A lot of people are resistant to utilization of apps for board games, and I totally understand that. But as a tool to help with the automation, it could be really helpful.
Yeah.
A lot of dungeon crawl type games work especially well with an app to drive things. Even coming out as a secondary thing, like Hero Quest, the modern remake of Hero Quest, that has an app that you can play with, or you can play in the traditional way, where it's 1v all, but using the app you can play fully cooperatively, or you can play solo to automate the opponent. And then there's also like Star Wars Imperial Assault, which is one of my favorite dungeon crawls of all time, has some really fantastic solo and cooperative modes that you can play with the app. When the game was intended for being like a hidden movement game, a 1v all. Now, the last thing that I think we should kind of touch on this this whole topic of solo gaming is like, what games do you think, if there's a portion of the audience here who have not dived into solo yet, what are to you like good solo gateway games? The games that you would be like, here are three that I'm pretty confident that if someone tried these, then it would give them a pretty good experience of solo. And if you like that, then I think you should, move on to other solo games based off of your own preferences.
Yeah, well, one game that I think is a good gateway game for solos, and then I also think is a good gateway game for just board games in general, would be Harmonies. Harmonies has a really approachable solo mode, that, especially if you are already aware of how the competitive version of the game works, or if you aren't aware of how the competitive version of the game works, Harmonies has a really solid solo mode to introduce people into that. Another one that I would recommend, because it kind of got me into solo gaming, would be Maki, which is solo only. You can do it print and play, and it works totally fine. But it's a solo only board game that has just enough challenges, but it's not overwhelming. I think that one is a really easy game to play, especially because it's print and play, and I think that's also like a massive part of the solo board gaming community is print and plays. I think Maki is a great introduction to how do solo board games work, and especially since that one is solo only, it doesn't have to like rearrange itself from being a different game to be a solo game. And then finally, and this one is more for a person who has played board games and is like really into the hobby, but maybe hasn't tried solo games. Spirit Island is the best solo game. Like that just
it's
it is a
it's
good
really good.
gateway game. It's a really good just end of if I had to choose one board game to play solo for the rest of my life, at the moment is a toss up between Imperium and Spirit Island. Like those are like the two best solo board games in my opinion. Now that Imperium Horizons is out and I've played it enough, I think I had it ranked lower in my solo board game ranking that we did when I first joined the channel because I hadn't played Horizons yet. But I think with Horizons, that's good. It's a great solo game. I don't think I would recommend Imperium as a gateway, whereas Spirit Island I think is approachable. You can learn how to play it cooperatively, and the experience is the same for the most part as the solo edition versus playing cooperatively. So those would probably be my three, and those are kind of approaching different levels
Right.
of experience in the hobby, with Harmonies being somebody who's new to board games in general, Maquis being somebody who has played board games. Maybe it isn't like as serious of a hobby as it is for like you and me. And then Spirit Island for somebody who is as serious as you and me, who is very into board games, but maybe hasn't played solo games yet.
Yeah. Well, I think those are fantastic choices. Mine, if I were to just add another three to that, because off the top of my head, Harmonies was one of the ones I was going to mention. Regicide is
Yeah.
a fabulous cooperative game, but it's really good as a solo game. And it has the kind of like cultural touchstone of you're playing with a deck of cards, which has, for a lot of people, the familiarity to Solitaire, which to many people they think that's the only tabletop game that's played solo, right? So having a deck of cards can give you that degree of feeling or familiarity, and everyone has a deck of cards somewhere, or at least access to a deck of cards. So low investment and fantastic game. Then I think that it may be a little bit more complex, but Terraforming Mars Ares Expedition is really soft on what the parameters are that you're having to face against. It's difficult to win, but it's not really difficult to work against, and it has the addition of giving you a slightly more rigid structure than what an opponent is going to do, which just turns the screw just a little bit. Not necessarily making a more interesting game, but it gives you just a little bit different of a view on what that game is in a really interesting way, which I have nothing but great things to say about that. And then from there, there's any number of games that you could check out, but I think so many people have access to Wingspan
Yeah.
or now any of the Span games. But I do really think that the solo mode for Wingspan is not really like noteworthy other than it's just so nice. It's just like very well put together, very well presented, very low overhead while still being more than just get as many points as you can. I think it beautifully like matches the level of game that Wingspan is by being more complex than just a light game, but not so complex that someone new to gaming would not be able to ever figure it out. And so I think Wingspan is probably the best solo adaptation that Stonemaier has done. Certainly the most accessible one. So I think that's a good way to go too.
Yeah, totally. And I think that the other recommendation I would have is more of a nebulous one, which is just if you really like a game and there is a solo mode for that game available either in the box, which would be, at least for a person starting out, would be my recommendation, is a lot of the board games you already own probably have a solo mode in the box. Or if you just really like a game and there's a solo mode available on Board Game Geek or Reddit or any of the other places where board game or solo board gamers are publishing rules for games that don't already have them, give that a go, because you already like that game, so you know at least that part of it is taken care of. Like, I think sometimes you might not like a game, and if you don't like that game, it might be difficult to enjoy the solo mode because you just don't like that game, and that's totally a reasonable take to have. But so many games that are coming out nowadays and that are getting into collections nowadays either already have a solo mode or have solo rules available online. Then I think I would recommend trying those out, because those are going to be the games that you've already gotten through the tough part, which is learning the base rules. The solo rules typically don't change the game you're playing that much, for the most part. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes, like the solo mode for Sky Team, some of the rules have changed a little bit because it's just one player as opposed to two players. But that's notwithstanding. Don't listen to those. Those are the exception,
I
not the
think
rule.
Eric's advice is spot on. If something is if it's something that you're passionate about, chances are that you're going to see the solo mode through to the end, and you will be able to maintain some objectivity that it's not the game that's bad. It may be the solo mode is bad. So if you already know that you like it, great. And that goes with gateway games in general. A lot of emphasis is put in this hobby about gateway games. You know, what's a good gateway game? To me, a good gateway game is one that is something that someone is really excited about and has an honest opinion about it. An example of that is like if your best friend is someone who is way into Lord of the Rings. They have not played any board games since Monopoly as a kid, but they've played plenty of like complex video games, and they understand that War of the Ring is a really heavy-duty war game. There's going to be tons of rules and components and all this stuff, and they're like, yeah, that sounds great. That's exactly what I want out of a big old board game. Then that could be the perfect gateway game for them.
Exactly. In one other thing I wanted to note, and this is kind of looping back to a different part of the conversation, but there's also so many resources online now to play board games in general that you can just filter for solo mode. So it's also easy to find games that interest you, like through Board Game Arena. They have a filter that is show me games that have solo modes, and there's a lot of them. There's so many of them, and I think that takes up so much of the administrative work that sometimes solo modes have, that it can be a very easy way for one, learning how to play the game, and then two, playing the game solo.
Totally.
So just as another thought, this is a much easier gateway to play solo modes, or just play board games in general, but solo modes that we did not have access to. I think this is a new development that Board Game Arena has as much of a collection as it does of solo games.
And
so
you'll get
2025
to
is a good year.
Yeah, you'll get to squeeze more out of that lemon. Things are expensive now, and if you haven't played your game solo, maybe that's a different take on them and a way to enjoy them that you hadn't in the past. And maybe you don't have to buy new games if you have 30 games on your shelf that have solo variants. Maybe it's a way to go. Yeah. But that also kind of represents our time to go and become solo, Eric. Solo apart for the evening.
We will part here. Thank you to our fantastic community for listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or questions, or you want to let us know what your favorite solo game is and why, first of all, I'd love to hear favorite solo games. I think I'm always interested to see what people think of as like their favorite solo game. So please,
And if you want to win a copy of Parks Second Edition, which has a solo mode and a better solo mode than Parks First Edition, you can comment over on the review that we have for, it'll probably be up for like another week. You can enter to win a copy of Parks.
Yeah.
That's a plug. Am I allowed to do a plug on this?
I
Eric,
think
you're kind of in charge of the podcast part.
I think it's your channel. You're allowed to do whatever you want on your channel. Take it. I don't know. Live your dreams, man. But
I'm a glutton for punishment.
Please comment down below with any of your questions, comments, or concerns, or email us at cardboardherald@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for tuning in. I have been Eric with Cardboard Herald, along here with Jack.
Bye, everyone.